If you've ever installed your jointer blades and aligned them using the OEM gauge that came with your jointer or a dial indicator, you may know that it can be frustrating, slow, and not always consistent and accurate. Today I'll be showing you how to use the little magnetic jig in this box to make your life a whole lot easier, simpler, more accurate, with a lot less tapping and guesswork, and in my case at least, a lot less frustrating. How's it? My name is Dylan and welcome to another edition of Ply Creations, where I try to make woodworking a little bit simpler for you guys out there. Today we'll be finally installing the blades into my jointer, and this is a follow-up on the video that I released about 2 weeks ago, where I sharpened the blades using the Veritas jointer blade sharpener jig, and I'm leaving the card on the screen where you'll be able to find a link to that video. Go and have a look at that, where I review and use the Veritas jointer, but the blades are sharp and it's time to get them into the jointer, and this is what this video is all about. So let's quickly look at the jigs that I have been using in the past and pain points of why I find them frustrating to use. You may be using either one of these two or something else. If you are using these two methods or something else with success, please leave us a note in the comments. I'd like to learn how you guys overcome whatever issues I'm experiencing with these. We're starting with the OEM jig. You'll get this with your jointer. This is the setting jig that sets the blade depth within the cutting head. It sets a fixed depth, so there's no adjustment really in regards to how far the blade protrudes in the cutting head when using this jig. So it's a little bit limiting, and it does assume that the cutting head is perfectly parallel and coplanar to the in-feed and out-feed table. So the setup of your jointer is quite important for this to be accurate. We're not chucking this. I do use this to set the blade initially and do the installation of the blade before I go over to the new jigs that I am using. The other option, of course, is using something like a dial indicator with a magnetic base. I have to say it's a very accurate way of setting your blade. However, what I do find is the setting of the blade is problematic, because you either need to push the blade down into the cutting head or lift it out of the cutting head. It's incredibly frustrating, and your jib screws that holds everything together needs to be at a very precise tension for you not to too quickly go too far either in or out. So I find, although accurate, I do find that process long, laborious, and relatively frustrating, and that's why I found a new solution, and I'll show you that next. And time for the big reveal, and these jigs are the ones that I have settled on, and very useful. On the other camera, I'm quickly going to show you the parts and give you an idea of how they work. So this is the body of the jig. Each side you have, shall we say, feet, and each one of them underneath have magnets. These are rare earth magnets, as far as I know, and they're quite strong. That gauge there, if you will, sets the depth of the blade in or out in relation to the upper surface of your cutting head, and that's the purpose of there. The way you adjust it in or out is by turning this knob here. If I turn it around, you'll see I've got a measurement gauge there that tells me how far in or out I've set, and then I've got a fractional gauge here that allows me more accurate adjustments. Then finally you have a locking knob here, and that allows you to set the gauge and then lock the locking knob to have the gauge set into a permanent position, which is going to be useful as we discuss how we install the blades. And that is the next step. So I'll bring you into the jointer and then we'll continue setting up the blade. Okay, time we got to why we're all here. That's installing and aligning the blades. A Couple of things I need to mention. One is always make sure your machine is unplugged when you work on it. Very important for your own safety. Two is familiarize yourself with your own machine. The way that your machine retains the blade, the way it sets the blade height may be different from mine. Be sure that you familiarize yourself with your own machine, especially the safety requirements. You'll notice that I've removed the fence on my machine, and that's for me to allow me to get access to the back of the cutting head. Also, it allows me access to the pulley that drives the cutting head, so that I don't need to use my digit to move a cutting head and then inadvertently slip and cut myself on newly sharpened blades. Also, I've dropped the the in-feed table all the way down. Not only does it drop the table down, but it also moves it away from the cutting edge, just provides me more space to work in and use the jigs. One or two quality of life tips: every time that I take out the blades and put in the new blades, I clean the recesses where the blade sits. I also give it a thin coat of light machine oil. It just stops excessive build-up of dust and so forth, so things don't get jammed. And that's the same with the jib, that keeps the pressure on the blade. I will lubricate the threads on these bolts as well, and that just allows me to remove them easier down the line. Do avoid heavy oils or heavy greases, because that will have the opposite effect and then cause a buildup of stuff so that you are unable to release it. I've already installed blade 1 and 2. I'm installing blade 3, and I'll take you through the process. Retaining bar goes in, blade goes in. Make sure it's the right way around. Not getting rid of this guy. This is now going to help us install the blade without having your fingers involved. If you don't have this, it might be a good idea to wear gloves. I prefer not to wear gloves in this particular situation. I lose tactile feel, which I do prefer. I do have this tool though. That pushes the blade in, it keeps even pressure. Then you tighten. You only need to tighten the middle screws, and only to a point where the blade won't slip out again. The outer bolts I'm not able to tighten, first of all, because the legs of this jig is in the way. But you also need to leave them loose anyway, because the new jig is sitting over those two bolts on either end of the cutting head, and you won't have access to that anyway, so leave them loose for now. Now we're going to be putting the jigs on, and you may notice that I've labeled the jig F and B for front and back. You'll be setting the jig for front and back on the cutting head, and those settings may not necessarily be exactly the same, so it's a good idea to mark the jigs so you can remember where they're supposed to go. If you just plonk the jig down onto the cutting head, this section here is going to hit the cutting edge, and it's going to damage the cutting edge you spend so much time sharpening. So be careful when installing the jig. It will either sit proud, or the blade will sit below the jig itself, depending on where this jig places the position of the blade in relation to the jigs. Also, what I find is if I like to have a level of consistency every time I use the jigs, and part of that consistency is provided by where you position the jig on the cutting head. And I line the far outer edge with the outer edge of the cutting head itself, and by doing that I know that I'm consistently putting the jig in the same position. So careful putting them down, and then move them around. So now the jig is in position. So as I mentioned earlier, the jig will either be high if your blade is protruding too much in relation to your setting, or the blade may be below the jig itself. How you make that adjustment is loosening the middle screws or bolts. And now I'm pushing the jig down to make sure it's seated all the way down. And now I'm retightening the retaining bolt. I'm removing the jigs, and now I'm tightening the ends down. Now, just to make sure that I've got tension on all the bolts, and this is also very, very important as far as your safety goes. You don't want any of the bolts to come loose and the blade coming out at you in use. You'll notice that I actually stagger how I tighten it to ensure that I have even pressure rather than just tightening from one end to the other. So I'll start in the middle. I'll go to one side, then go to the opposing side. That one is loose, so good thing I'm checking it. Then skipping back, and then to the end. And just check one more time. Really, really important that you check and recheck those bolts. Okay, quick test to see if I'm happy with the settings, and for that I just need a piece of wood like this, nothing special about it, apart from the fact that the bottom surface that sits on the outfeed table needs to be flat. I can either get it flat by doing it on the jointer. Do remember that you need to do that before you swap out the blades, or you can use a hand plane. On the section of wood, I've made a reference line using a square, and I place the section of wood on the outfeed table, lining up the mark that I've made with the front of the outfeed table. I've also placed the cutting head so that the blade's cutting edge is under the outfeed table. I now advance the head forward. The cutting edge should grab the wood and then pull it forward, and what that tells me is how far the cutting edge of the blade is above the surface of the cutting head. I work in a range, so anything 8 millimeters or less for me is suitable. I need to check both sides of the blade as well as all the other blades. I have already done the other blades, so just do the one end here and then we would be done. Again, moving the cutting edge back, advancing it forward. The cutting edge grabs and then pulls the wood forward. So I'm happy with where I am in the settings. Do keep in mind that it is the depth or the height of your infeed table that determines the depth of the cut, and you want your outfeed table to be slightly lower than the apex of where the cutting edge will meet the wood during the cut. Next is I'm going to be moving over to discuss these jigs in a little bit more detail. And after we've done that, we'll do a test cut, get everything back together and assembled, and do a test cut. So as a recap, why do I like these little guys so much? They are easy to use, they are easy to set up, quick to use, and provide me with accurate and repeatable results every time I install a set of blades into my jointer. That saves me a lot of frustration, and that makes me happy. Why should you get it? If you're trying to upgrade, or if you'd like to upgrade your OEM alignment jig, that is a good option. If you're using another method to set up the blades in your jointer and it's a frustrating process or it drives you up the wall, another good reason to get these. But I'll leave a link in the description where I got mine, and another link where you might find it if you're not based in South Africa as I am. So go and check that out. If you haven't seen the video where I sharpen my jointer blades, please go over and have a look at that. Also leaving the link in the description. If you've ever considered sharpening your own blades, the jointer jig to be able to do that's a really, really good option and a solid tool to use for that purpose. But this brings us to the end of another edition of Ply Creations. I'm leaving you with footage of where I'm processing a section of lumber after I've got everything back together and assembled. But as always, thank you so much for joining me in my workshop. I'm leaving, as always, the link to my website at the bottom of the page. Remember, you can still get your hands on the plans for the mobile base. I'll leave the link in the description for that, as well as a nice infographic that will help you manage tear out in your workshop. So both of them are free downloads. So go and have the links and head over to the sites and download your own copies. But as always, thank you so much for joining me. Be safe in your workshop and careful of those sharp edges. I hope you have a good one. Cheers.